We're talking today about a difficult topic and one we should note will involve some discussion of suicide. And if you or someone that you know needs help, you can reach out to the 24-hour crisis lifeline by dialing 988. But to talk about this issue, I'm joined here in studio by Lieutenant Sheryl Rodgers, a firefighter paramedic with the Jacksonville Fire and Rescue Department and regional coordinator for Florida Firefighters Safety and Health Collaborative. Good morning, Sheryl. Welcome back.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Joining us by video, Chris Scallon, a retired Norfolk police sergeant and co-founder of Trauma Behind the Badge. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning. How you doing?
Very well. Thanks for being here. We're also joined here in studio by Dr. Lanty Jornby, Chief Medical Officer at Lakeview Health, an addiction treatment center here in Jacksonville. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Chris, I want to start with the work that you're doing today, but I also want to talk about the work that you've done in the past. What kind of work experience led you to be involved in trauma advocacy work for law enforcement and former law enforcement?
Great question. As a former firefighter, medic, and military veteran and police officer, I had the luxury, or not the luxury, of being exposed to all the significant traumas that are specific to those disciplines. I myself saw the adverse effects of long-term, both cumulative and acute exposure to trauma, and wound up needing help myself and found the field of help very limited. So I took it upon myself to try to find all the resources for varying degrees of problems that I was seeing, both within myself and in my community, in the veteran or the first responder community. And since then have been involved with responses to crisis for the veterans and first responder community, from large-scale mass casualty events to personal occurrences within their own life and their family.
You received a diagnosis in your life after the work that you had done both overseas and here in the United States with law enforcement. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression with suicidal ideations, and my time in the military resulted in traumatic brain injury, which adds a little flavoring and little spices to the existing diagnoses.
And your suicidal ideation was actually manifested in a few suicide attempts. Is that correct?
That's correct. While I was on the job on the police department, it got it became overwhelming. And to be more specific, it was less wanting to die and more wanting that emotional pain to stop, and really not seeing a way outside of that, which now, knowing hindsight 2020, that help is out there and resources are available.
I saw in an interview you talked about finding your tribe when you were able to begin talking about some of these things. And I thought it was a kind of a cute comparison to a video that was popular in the early 90s. Tell us a little bit about that metaphor.
I actually used that video of the girl with the little bee, dressed as a bee, and she was walking around and couldn't find anybody. She thought she was different and weird, and then she ran into a field of people dancing in the same kind of outfit. It's exactly it. I felt like I was the only one going through this, and nobody could understand. I was weak for it, and I was scared to ask anybody because I was normally the person that people ask for help. So it was a little intimidating, and what I tell folks now is that the day I started getting better was the day I stopped focusing on what other people thought and more how I could get better.
Sheryl Rodgers, what did you know about the job of being a firefighter when you joined, and how was reality different from what you expected?
Yeah, I knew I wanted to help people, and they would pay me to help people. How awesome is that? So I was super excited about the job, and I knew I would experience some things, but no idea what exactly those experiences would look like and how exactly they would affect me over time.
Mm-hmm. And so as you began to experience the job, how did those experiences come at you? How did you deal with them, and how did they begin to accumulate and impact you?
So dealing with them, we're kind of taught in our profession. We use dark humor to laugh things off and don't really talk about feelings, and we kind of push it aside. And you kind of follow suit of what everybody else is doing. So that's kind of what you're taught. It's kind of a learned behavior, and it worked until it didn't work. Um, Cumulative, I would say, is the key. I don't recall any one particular traumatic event that I experienced affecting me, but I recall over time, all of a sudden it just seemed like things were out of control.
Hmm. I think you did tell me about an experience just after you had children
Mhm.
that some of those experiences felt differently or felt like you were having a different experience.
Sure, I've always said perspective is everything. So, I didn't realize, or I should say, seeing kids in traumatic situations didn't affect me as much until I became a mother. And then when you have that, mother mentality, it changes your perspective of when you see those events.
Hmm. And so there was a drowning that you were called to.
Yeah, so we had a drowning, and my son at the time was the same age as this little boy. And my son had blonde hair and blue eyes, and this little boy had blonde hair and blue eyes. And working that child in the back of the rescue unit, probably the only time that I've had experienced an adrenaline dump after the call, where I just started shaking violently and became nauseated all of a sudden. And, in the moment, I was just trying to do my job, but I remember thinking, wow, this kid really looks like my son. And then after the call, just kind of just fell apart and just needed a minute to recover from that. And I don't recall any other call affecting me in that way afterwards.
And was it the kind of thing that you continued to think about afterwards?
Um, Immediately, I wanted to call. It was later at night, but I made my husband at the time wake my son up, and I wanted to hear his voice. I just had to hear him and know that he was okay. And once I did that, I was okay. But yeah, I mean, you think about it from time to time, and you have those triggers, but not to the extent of that experience in that moment. But you're always going to think about the things that you've experienced.
Dr. Landy Jordanby, these challenges that people face when they work in this field, they are facing more trauma on a daily basis than most people probably do in their entire lives. And that can manifest in a bunch of different ways. What is it that you see primarily in your work, in your profession?
With veterans or first responders, we see a tremendous amount of trauma. And I think Sheryl hit on it, Chris hit on it. It's not just a one-time event, it's repeated trauma. They are exposed to multiple difficult things that they have to see, take care of, put aside their own emotion so they can handle this usually life-threatening situation. So when they come to us, they are most likely suppressing a lot of that. They haven't dealt with it. Or if they have dealt with the trauma, it's in unhealthy ways. So we know that there are a lot of veterans that, or even first responders that reach for substances because they get an immediate relief, but that becomes more of a dangerous thing. It damages their health long term, and it really prevents deeper healing from the trauma or from any co-occurring disorder that they're dealing with.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about the unique mental health challenges faced by current and former first responders. And if you're a first responder yourself or you have a story to share, you can join our conversation live on air by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. Sheryl, what Dr. Jordanby was talking about in terms of substance abuse, there can be a culture of, sort of celebratory, I don't know what you would call it. I mean, it's kind of, there's a little bit of a culture of the party, when someone is done with a shift in the world of the firefighters. And it's not universal, but it's not uncommon, right? When are you watching for when that crosses over into problem territory?
Yeah, that's tough because, typically first responders are type A personalities. We work hard, we party hard. Where that becomes warning signs, it's often hard to see. I think what I have learned in my own experience is when things became to the point that they took over other things in my life and made it so that I couldn't function on an everyday basis like what normal person. I didn't know what normal was. I thought what I was doing was normal, but it turns out that was nowhere near normal. I just knew it to be normal.
And is it normal because you're seeing it reflected in the behavior of those around you?
I think so, and we just, I guess because of the stigma for so long, we didn't talk about it for a while, and so I didn't really know if others were experiencing that same thing that I was experiencing on a day-to-day basis. I just kind of assumed.
Chris Gallen, talk about that, if you will, in terms of the culture of some of these agencies and how stress is commonly processed when it comes to substances.
Yeah, and the lieutenant said it was she was right on point. Our culture is we celebrate and we mourn using alcohol or substances, primarily alcohol for first responders, and it's become part of the culture, and it's anything outside of the norm, because there's very few things that we can control as first responders and veterans. So the little bit of control that we have, we kind of hold on to pretty significantly. So part of that is almost a rite of passage. I mean, I was in the Navy, and the Navy's theme song has drinking in it. I mean, it's embedded into everything that we've done. And when we mourn together, the same thing. It's tough because people are different, and some people can function in that kind of atmosphere and not go to excess, where some don't. So it's exactly what the lieutenant was saying. We have to kind of be aware, or at least look out for one another and say, hey, listen, this is kind of taking over your daily life, where it wasn't just a one or two time thing, or every time something kind of happens, but it's becoming more habitual, and it's becoming more of an issue, and we start seeing it in behavior. The problem we have is nobody wants to have that awkward talk, and first responders, we're quick to tell you what to do as a citizen, but very, very awkward for us to kind of monitor ourselves and be, hey, listen, I think you're struggling, because we perceive that as a sign of weakness when we're struggling. When actuality, it's not. It's a sign of being human.
Whose job is that in, for instance, just in law enforcement? Is it the job of your peer, or is it the job of your superior? Who should be taking up that difficult conversation?
So it's safety. And every discipline that I've worked in, everybody has the right and the obligation to say something. And I preach that, and that's part of the culture, and getting over that stigma is, if I say something about you as a peer, as a coworker, as a supervisor, as a subordinate, it's not because I'm trying to get you in trouble. It's because I'm worried about you, and I truly care about what happens to you. If I didn't care, that me not saying anything is a pretty good indicator that I just don't care. So I think it's everybody's responsibility. And sometimes it's hard when you're in the midst of this either addiction or struggle or mental health crisis to really kind of get yourself out. But the key to this is that most first responders and veterans don't want to be fixed. They just want to be given the tools to help fix themselves. And if that means providing a little help along the way for them, like, hey, I'll walk you to the doctor, or I'll walk to the meeting with the supervisor, or whatever that looks like. Sometimes that's what we need.
We have a message from John on Facebook. He says, Jacksonville-based LSF Health Systems has for years been managing a major state-funded program for first responders' mental health. Those who think they might need help should visit stayfitforduty.com. And so there are options out there. Dr. Jordan B., the numbers in terms of first responders and police and firefighters specifically who have died by suicide relative to those who have died in the line of duty really surprised me. I mean, that there is far more people dying from suicide than from the on-the-job risks.
Yes, unfortunately, we've seen that even through COVID. I think it actually went up for most of the population, but then you add in the stresses, the unique stresses that first responders are dealing with, that veterans are dealing with, that even active duty military are dealing with, and so that just spikes it even further. And I think Chris and Sheryl have kind of hit on it, is that these are people that have devoted their lives to others. They are the ones that run into the burning building. And when it comes to taking care of themselves and asking for help, it comes with possibly some shame, some belief that they are just not strong enough, because the culture is definitely in the military and veterans as well as first responders, is that they're superheroes. They are the ones that tell other people what to do and take care of everyone. And being able to ask for help and get into treatment, whatever that looks like, is a very hard thing to do. So I feel like, Cheryl and I were talking earlier, peer support is so key to getting, that one moment where they say, okay, I've got to get help. Talking to a peer and then getting that peer to direct them to the right place is key.
Chris, one of the challenges you talked about was just, the culture, but there are real practical challenges for a law enforcement officer, say, who's facing, or someone who's in the military, who's facing a mental health crisis because they are entrusted with carrying weapons and they don't want to be seen as unstable for that reason. It can actually have really profound impacts on their job. So how do you help someone who's concerned about that particularly balance that if they want help but they don't want to put their careers at risk or make people think that they're not stable because of the work that they're doing?
No, it's a great question, and quite honestly, it's the one I get all the time. And there's two aspects of it. The first one is it's a job, and I would much rather you be healthy than try to exist in an unhealthy environment. I'm not saying unsafe, because a lot of the stuff we do is there's an inherent danger to it. But when it comes to getting help or not getting help because of the job, I try to have them focus on the long run. Some people don't need to be doing this. And at certain points in time, if mental health creeps up or substance issues creep up, they don't need to be doing that job right now. Some people can return. That's a possibility. And more people need to understand that getting help does not automatically equate to losing your job or losing your security clearance. There's a pause. It's the same thing as if I broke my leg. Could I be doing the same job? No. I've got to fix my leg. I've got to let that heal. It's no different when we're dealing with mental health or substance issues. So it's getting the idea, which is part of the stigma, that if I get help, I won't be able to work or I won't be able to do this. I can't say that blanketly because some people have issues that far surpass their ability to work. So it's a case by case, but predominantly people getting help actually return to the workforce and become unbelievable advocates for healthiness and a healthy living while doing this very inherently dangerous and taxing job. So it's a benefit to support the folks that are asking for help and willing to get it and going through the work and then coming back and have them as champions to make your agency better by having a healthier person working in it.
Cheryl, I want to ask you about just the demands of the job and particularly something about scheduling, because we know that there's a lot of things that go into people experiencing stress and clearly seeing traumatic events, seeing injured children or kids who've been abused or whatever that particular traumatic trigger is for someone is only exacerbated by things like if you're not sleeping. So tell us a little bit about the schedule that, for instance, firefighters are on and how that can contribute to experiences of stress.
Yeah, I've been kind of banging the drum of circadian rhythm and all the links that it has to all the problems or a lot of the problems in our professions for a while now.
And explain what circadian rhythm is for people who don't.
Circadian rhythm is your body's on-off cycle. So we're designed to shut down at night and sleep. And during that sleep process, our cells regenerate, our body heals itself, our mind actually processes and files all the things we experience that day. It holds them, I call them in like an upload file, and then it downloads them to where they're supposed to go and files them appropriately during that time. Unfortunately, as first responders or anybody really in a shift work type base environment, you don't get that time to shut down and process. We work typically as firefighters 24-hour shifts. Our typical schedule is 24 on, 48 off. So in that 24-hour period, you have a bed you can try to sleep in, but you're going to get woken up throughout the night regardless of, where you are. Most of the time you're going to get up and go on calls. That's just the nature of the job. We sleep when we can, we eat when we can, but when the buzzer goes off, we get up and we go. So we don't typically have that time to shut down and process all that we're supposed to do and the way our body's supposed to heal during that shift work. And then when we go home, we have to get off that morning and go function as a normal human being. So, we're sleep deprived and we have to pick up our kids from school and we have to take them to practice and we have to do all the things, that our family expects of us and with a smile on our face and not be grumpy about it, And then we get that night to kind of rest and process. And then the next night, when we're going to go back to work the next morning, your mind's already in that mindset of, okay, tomorrow I'm going to work. I don't want to oversleep. I want to make sure, nothing happens. How am I going to keep my crew and everybody safe tomorrow? So you really have one night and that's it. And your body doesn't get that time to shut down and process and regenerate the way it's supposed to. And then you add to that, I think, overtime stresses of the job. I think firefighters, I joke you can go into any fire station in any city and probably see a CPAP machine in the bunk room because where our sleep cycles are so messed up. It doesn't matter if we're healthy because we tend to be typically healthier, as a population in the fire service, but you can walk in any bunk room and probably see a CPAP machine because we don't sleep well even when we do try to sleep because our body's now just used to not sleeping well. And it affects so many things. It affects disease. I think it contributes to the cancer that's in the fire service. I think it contributes to the mental health problems that are in the fire service. I think it contributes to so many things. And a lot of departments, I think, are starting to recognize that and looking at the research and starting to change some of the way our shift schedules are.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit because firefighters, for instance, here, when you talk about a 24-hour cycle, that's an 8 a.m. to 8 a.m.
Correct.
So you go to work at 8 a.m. and then you get off at 8 in the morning and
Right.
you basically are then embarking on a full day, but not everybody does it that way.
No, not everybody. So I know, for instance, Tallahassee, I know for years has worked on a 7 p.m. to 7 p.m. schedule. So they relieve at 7 o'clock at night. And
that gives them an opportunity to kind of go home and go
right.
to bed.
That's the nice thing about that. You can go home and sleep in your own bed and recover. So you're getting the same number of calls in that 24-hour shift as you do, on our shift. But then you get to go home and lay in your own bed and kind of regenerate and process and recover. Some departments are going to 24/72s instead of 24/48, so you have one extra day off in between. Some departments are looking at the sleep environment in the stations and giving people more individual, because we kind of sleep in a gen pop type environment where there's just one room with a bunch of bunks in it. So kind of segregating off each room. And then when the tones go off, if you have a multi-company station where there's like an engine and a rescue and a ladder, if the engine goes on a call, the ladder and the rescue's sleeping area don't activate, for them to wake up. So their sleep isn't interrupted needlessly when they're not even supposed to go on the call. So there's a lot of things that I think from a health and safety standpoint, fire departments are looking at, and that's a good thing. But I think we still have a really long way to go, unfortunately.
Dr. Joran, how important is the structural elements, things like sleep, when it comes to correcting for some of the workplace traumas that first responders experience? Are there other things that are structural that could help reshape how damaging some of those experiences can be?
Well, I think Sheryl did a great job of explaining what happens when you sleep. Your body does just heal, regenerate, recover. The whole part that she explained about processing all the information that you took in during the day, your experiences, traumatic events that you responded to, life-threatening events that you saw, all of that stuff gets processed in the brain in certain areas. And if you don't get that time to do that, it still kind of sits in kind of the more recent parts of the brain, and then it can become, not for everybody, but it can become something that you can't let go. And then we kind of think about repeated traumas on top of that. You layer more and more exposure to events and traumatic things, and you never get to process it in a deeper part of the brain. And so then it's so recent, it's so accessible that it can create problems with, just day-to-day function. Making sure that you get sleep when you're not working, when your sleep it becomes disrupted with nightmares or other events like that. So I think some of the things she mentioned are really great, and I hadn't heard about them. Changing the structure, changing the time frame of their shifts, making sure that certain environments aren't exposed to other parts of the station so people can get into some of sort of deeper sleep, because those deeper sleep, the REM sleeps, for really where you're going to have more healing. So I think what they're doing is great.
Do we know if there are
Sure.
there certain kinds of traumas that hit people harder than others, or does it really just depend on the individual?
I think it's individual by individual, although, Cheryl shared something about taking care of a child that had been a victim of a drowning. I mean, that was a very individual thing for her, but I think we are all somewhat not desensitized, but sensitized to a child and a helpless individual that's in a life-threatening event. And so that's always going to really affect us in many ways. But I have seen veterans who were really affected by certain things they saw on the battlefield, or even veterans who were pilots who end up taking out targets and things like that, that they were really affected because of certain experiences that they had gone through. So it really is, I would say, individualized.
Chris, I know that there's some states that have been expanding their definition of who can file a claim for a traumatic experience at work. And I mean, it's sort of not everybody knows, but I mean, if there was a workplace shooting, for instance, where I work, I would probably be eligible to file for, a claim of some injury. Law enforcement, first responders very often aren't able to because it's sort of expected, right, that that's the job. But that's changing where I think there are more places that recognize PTSD or a traumatic experience as something that is an actual legitimate claim.
Yeah, and the doc would probably speak to this a little bit more better as far as the measurable injury. But trauma is a measurable injury to the brain, and there are states. Again, this is slow moving. And when Lieutenant was talking about the changes, and sometimes maybe they're not as quick enough, and I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, we're moving, and maybe not as fast as I want to, for the sake of the first responders and veterans. But we are moving. The environment that we're seeing, the landscape that we see now for the willingness to kind of address these issues is a lot better than it was when myself, or I'm sure the lieutenant, first started, where having a conversation in private, let alone on air, would never have happened. But yeah, so each states are different, and again, I'd like to see maybe a federal collaborative effort to kind of maybe have a blanket type of understanding. But listen, until then, there are resources that are available, and I encourage, no matter what state you're in, and I've been fortunate to travel kind of around the country with this. It's funny that all these states are different, but we're all working on the same kind of issue. But I would say be a champion for the cause. Be a student of your craft. If you're struggling or you work with folks that are struggling, see what's regionally available, what's nationally available. They're out there, and some of the leaders in policies of all disciplines are actually working on this. And to me it's encouraging. Again, I wish it was a little bit faster, but there are things there. So, and any questions, look to your state and look to your local, regional, and national resources.
Cheryl, first of all, I'd like you to characterize how receptive firefighters, for instance, are to change.
There's a standing joke in the fire service: two things firefighters hate the most: change and the way things are. And I always say it would be funny if it weren't so true. We're not typically receptive to change. We like our traditions, we like our culture, and when typically people come in using the word change, we tend to shut down almost immediately. I think it's moving, like he said. I think the stigma's starting to go away, and people are talking, but it's always in small doses, especially in our line of work. It's you have to baby step them through it.
One of the things that you have worked on is the issue of the hazards of certain things that are beyond trauma and beyond just the workplace dangers, but things like uniforms, which have for a long time been a carcinogenic risk to firefighters because of the flame retardant that they contain. A lot of firefighters got sick, and that's a whole different area, but one that has been very difficult to change.
Yes, and I kind of wanted to touch on that when Chris mentioned earlier. It is such a suicide is such an up and coming cause of death in firefighters, but cancer is right now the leading cause of death. And we were all taught in when we came on that heart disease was the leading cause. And heart disease, I think, if suicide were recognized as a line of duty death, heart disease would be a dismal third, because I think it would be cancer and then suicide. And it's unfortunate that it's not recognized. as it should be. But there's so many things in this job that are harmful to us, the things we're exposed to, not just visually, but, chemically, all the exposures that we have in the fire station, our gear, our station uniforms, the diesel exhaust on the apparatus that we ride on. There's a million things, that cause cancer, and we know that within the general population. But when you look at firefighters and the things we're exposed to daily, you kind of see every third day that chronic low dose exposure that we're getting on a constant basis for 20 or 30 years. And then that's why we're seeing these high incidences of cancer and I think mental health issues as well.
We did get a message on Facebook from somebody who's raising an interesting point about racial disparities in terms of the care that firefighters or first responders have received historically in the realm of mental health. What are your thoughts about that disparity and whether that's getting any better, Dr. Dornby?
I think that's very interesting because through COVID, we actually saw a disparity for people of color as far as substance use. So traditionally, the numbers show that Black people or Hispanic people were not as susceptible to overdose rates or overdose deaths. But through COVID, we actually saw the numbers of people of color actually go up as far as overdose deaths. So we're now recognizing that that is not an exclusive issue for a Caucasian person. And in fact, people of color really do suffer from higher rates of substance use. And I think that goes hand in hand with mental health too. So I would agree that there has been a disparity as far as recognizing that someone of color is dealing with a mental health issue, whether it be PTSD. We saw it in the VA system when I worked there. And I think that the more recognition we give it, we can certainly make more efforts to reach out to those populations and get people into treatment, because PTSD and substance use and mental health disorders don't discriminate. They affect everybody and in really definite severe ways.
Chris, I saw a panel discussion that you did some time back where you were talking about being able to look for the right thing, and you were talking about being trained by another officer when you were finding a gun or looking for a gun, and he kind of redirected you. Can you explain why that metaphor was helpful in terms of the issue of substance abuse and suicide risk?
Yeah, so basically you're trying to find a needle in a stack of needles, a very specific needle. And at a field training officer, actually one of the guys that I worked with, and he said, Chris, if you want to find a gun on somebody and you're looking, and I train you how to find a gun on somebody, you'll find 90% of the guns. But if I train you how to find a razor blade, you'll find 100% of the guns. So the razor blade to me was these subtle shifts in personality, the subtle changes in relationship dynamics, and focusing on individuals and how they respond in certain situations. So instead of just every time I see you at a party you're drinking or you're using, how about do I know your baseline, or am I only seeing you at a party? So the idea of looking for the razor blade to find all the guns is looking for those little subtle cues that are, in all actuality, aren't very subtle once you start understanding what to look for. So that helped me identify what I was struggling with substance issues. But once I figured that out, it made it a little bit easier to kind of identify folks that are struggling.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here for this important discussion. Sheryl Rodgers, Chris Scallon, Dr. Lanty Jornby. Thanks all of you so much for being with us today.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Thank you very much for having me.